Rime of the Frostmaiden, Chapter 7, Doom of Ythryn. This chapter is made for ninth level characters. Now, it involves the player characters having traveled through and gotten all the way to the Great Glacier and then through the Caves of Hunger, and finally have arrived in the fallen and buried Netherese city of Ythryn, likely led there by Valen Harpel, or perhaps they went there just to explore buried ancient ruins and find treasures and experience what they might find there, which in this case might be Nothix, which, as you can see by this image. Now, the main boss in this area, and some would say the real main boss of the campaign, is Iroth, I can pronounce it right, Larthus, the demilich, not Auril the Frostmaiden. Now, this is a bit odd, of course, as it seems like Frostmaiden should be the final boss in perhaps some fourth final form. But if you want to run your campaign where the Frostmaiden flees from her abode and arrives in Ythryn, then she could make a better final boss, although she might need to be not necessarily beefed up, but given some additional aid. There is an option in the end of the chapter where Auril does arrive at Ythryn because it's a likely place where she would go, along with some forces that would be with her. The Demilich can be located in the central spire of the city, which is right here. Player characters such as my group might emerge from the Caves of Hunger, cross this little bridge, enter the city, and say, hey, let's just go to the center of the biggest tower and finish this whole thing up. You could do that, although technically the main entrance is protected by a wall of force, which is very difficult to take down unless the player characters have a disintegrate spell. Much of this adventure involves, or this chapter involves going to different locations in Ythryn and trying to figure out how to get past that barrier. There are, of course, other locations scattered about, including a library, a some of the Coliseum. It's more like a stadium for a game called Chain Lightning, involving some Megan, which are like artificial humanoids, which will be found several times in this adventure. But there's also some other additional locations the player characters could come across as well. And this adventure is fairly open, so the DM could create new locations, such as if the player characters want to start just searching ruined buildings in one particular segment of this adventure, or maybe some of these little towers. Although one of these towers should actually be missing. It's probably one of them that's buried in the ice. That's the upside down tower the player characters would have likely encountered in the second chapter of Rime of the Frostmaiden. It was part of the city and it broke off. Now, as you go into the adventure, you get information on the fall of Ythryn and the fate of Netherese and other such things. This city didn't fall with the other cities of Netherese. It fell on its own, and it had its own different history of what became of the various residents and everything. Many of the other cities died when Mistril was destroyed by Karsus, and everything again fell out of the sky, but most of the citizens of the city were killed in the crash, although some survived and some were turned into monsters. Now, it is a necropolis as the city is ruined. There are a number of locations scattered across the city, as I noted, and again, the players can really explore them however they wish. The DM again could expand the adventure a bit too. Eventually, the player characters will encounter some sort of random encounters, and this is a fairly high level random encounter table. Note some of these creatures are exclusive to this adventure, although you could use them in additional campaigns, such as the Living Bigby's Hands, or Spitting Mimics, or the Tomb Trapper, or Tomb Tapper. In any case, the player characters should encounter some of these creatures, and many of which player characters may never have encountered before, making them interesting enemies. There's also some magic features, such as continual flame spells that are still functioning, and enchantment that, despite the fact that the city is resting at an angle, the gravity is unaffected, and the player characters feel like they are walking straight up. Also, there is the likelihood the player characters might contract arcane blight, a disease that might turn them into nothix if they spend too much time in the city, which almost makes it the city having a time crunch. Now, there is a possibility the player characters will realize this is happening and will just go back to the caves of hunger and try to rest there. That could happen. Or they could, you know, just leave. Or they could come back several times to complete this adventure, depending on their resources. Now, in order to get into the central tower, which is the main goal of this adventure, they have to complete the Rite of Arcane Octade. Basically, they have to figure out the 8 different things that have to be done in front of the wall of force that prevents access to the Mythalar, as well as the access to the main tower. And they're really simple things, but the player characters won't know what they are until they go to each of 8 different locations and start doing them in the correct order. Now, there are more than 8 locations in this adventure. These just represent 8 towers that the player characters could go to and get each piece of information from. There's also some treasures that could be found. This is a pretty simple treasure table. There's a lot more treasures you could probably find in the ruins of this city. I feel like this particular city in general could almost be several chapters if the DM wanted to just expand it, or perhaps if the DM wanted to do just follow up locations under the city. There's so much you could do here in a ruined Netherese city. There's some of the imagery again, kind of a vague image, but a kind of gets the tone of the city and all that for what it is. There is lore about Ythryn that the player characters might notice on some of these friezes or frescoes they might pick up in the city. This could be information that random NPCs might know if they come across someone that is willing to talk to them, of course. Now, as you go into the adventure, we do get key locations, the Ice Causeway when the player characters arrive, including a dead tomb tapper, which is something they will likely encounter at some point in the adventure. The wizard spires are what the player characters are really going to go towards, and these are the locations where the keys or the clues to get into the main tower will be found. There are a lot of gargoyles roaming about the city that are going to be more of a nuisance than anything else. There's the chain lightning stadium that I mentioned earlier. You can more or less trigger the game once you walk into it, and essentially it's like a athletics game where the player characters are competing against another team. The team is made up of summoned Megan, Galvin Megan in this case. They are creatures from first edition that were brought back for this campaign. They act as sort of like living magical mannequins than anything else. And it's just kind of a unique mini game within the game. The DM, if you don't like the idea of using a mini game, you could say that the stadium was broken and malfunctioning, and instead of the game taking place, there's a chain lightning spell, and then a bunch of Megan show up and they go get violent. There's a couple of things you can do with it, but it depends on how you want to run your campaign, of course. There are rules for the game itself. It's not really that complicated. I won't go into all of them, but it is a mini game, effectively. Here's one of the towers, the Tower of Abjuration. The 8 towers represent the 8 schools of magic, and so do the clues. Again, more Megan to be found here, and the anvil of disjunction to be found here. Essentially, an object that can be used to destroy a magic item that isn't an artifact. It's an interesting item, to say the least. Some inscriptions, which will be the clue the player characters need. In this case, in Draconic, it reads, "First shield thy heart with a wand from the Nether Oak," which means they have to go find out where Nether Oak is, which they will get to. It's one of the locations they can go to. There is a prison, and it has a maze of cells, of course, an infirmary where there is an invisible doppelganger who is under a sequester spell. He could be used more of as a role-playing encounter than anything else. He doesn't really understand what has happened as he's been in that state for some time, but it's a good role-playing situation. As we get further down, we get the main spire entrance that will lead essentially up via the magical elevator past the force field to get to, well, the top spire here, where the demilich can be found. When I ran this adventure, we didn't have much time left for the campaign, so we kind of skipped the outer stuff and went right to the center. And I think I said that the force field was malfunctioning. If you really need to do that, you can, but I think the adventure is much more interesting if the player's characters get to explore everything else and then come back here. In my particular group's case, there wasn't much of a group left at that point, and we just wanted a good conclusion, and at least they got that. Although they missed a lot of fun locations, treasure, and different monsters they could have encountered. Now, I won't go into every single tower, but there are, conjured creatures, and in the Tower of Conjuration, there's another clue. There's, of course, treasure. There is obviously, a hag coven. I think they're all night hags that have their own names: anti-pinch, anti-pillage, and anti-plunder, who are open for business. There's the House Tower of the Arcane, and there are some interesting things here, essentially. Windows depicting different cantrips being cast, a magical goblet, and depending on what the player characters do, like if they drink from this magical goblet, they will get a random charm. I don't, it depends on what they roll. The player characters won't know what the charms are going to be, but they're related to different cantrips, and they're just going to be random based on what happens. So it's an interesting little extra thing the player characters can find. There's a library where they will encounter an Arcanoloth who is living here along with a awakened penguin named Kingsport. He could be used as a great role playing counter or just a dangerous threat. He's more of a sage than anything and not necessarily threatening toward the player characters, but he's searching the remnants of the library and probably has been here for some time. There are some remaining bits of treasure as well. Here's a Kingsport, by the way. He's an Emperor Penguin. Other little bits and treasures within the library, some other scrolls that are quite powerful, a chime of opening, things like that. There's the Arboretum, where you can find Nether Oak. He is a treant, where the player characters can get a piece of wood, essentially for a wand if they need it. It's also there's some needle blights there, and it could be an expanded area if, especially if the player characters there's a druid in the group. It could be really interesting to expand what might be there. I feel like a lot of these areas are just shown as a single room, like the Tower of Divination, for example. They're shown as just one location, but individually, each tower could be its own little sub adventure that have multiple levels that the DM could just create maps for, and they would be a lot more interesting. And you could put some more unique creatures in there, like say will-o-wisps, or like like an intelligent wand or something like that that's out of control. You could do all kinds of things, and there you can bring on all kinds of additional creatures that expand on each tower, which is one of my only criticisms of this particular adventure. Now, there is the Wellspring of Answers. Again, I'm not going to go into every detail, but there's sort of a creature living here. It is, I believe, represented as a hydra, but it's meant to be like a terrifying outer space creature, like a Lovecraftian creature. But it's got a telepathic pentacle effect, and it's very, let's just say, interesting. It goes into the horror aspect of the campaign, and well, you get more into that as you kind of look into it. There is a Bazaar of the Bazaar, of course. There is a Headless Iron Golem. The player characters encounter the head in the prior chapter. It's still functioning. The head still kind of functions, and the body functions, although it's blinded and deafened without the head, which makes it a weakened enemy. There is the Hall of Silk, where some Demos Magian are maintaining the area, and a lot of this spider silk is worth quite a lot of gold, and it's just been here for centuries, though. The observatory, where more Megan are just kind of doing their own business, as well as a blue slade, and there's also a green slade that is at the telescope. Here's an image of him. He's not looking at much because he's just seeing ice. Maybe he's insane. He's madly fiddling with the telescope, and he's not getting very far because the city's trapped under the ice. There is a menagerie building where you can create a chimeric creature. These are little animals that have differences than their real world counterpart: a hare, feathered wings, and a fly speed, a rat with gills, etc., etc. It's kind of a fun location to visit, and there's a lot of locations like this in the city. The theater itself, with some different scripts that the player characters could look through and interesting interactions. Now you get to the Tower of Necromancy, where there's literally like 200 crawling claws tirelessly trying to excavate the tower's ruin brick by brick, and clawing their way forward. The player characters aren't expected to fight every single one of these clawing claws, but if they interfere, a certain number will attack them. You can increase these numbers if you really want, but not 100% necessary. There's also a ghost of the High Necromancer who will be here as well and might get involved in this. Again, this location is mostly destroyed, so it's one of those locations the DM wouldn't have to expand on unless you want to do like some sort of ghost tower or something like that. The Spire of Irialarthus is the main location, and it shows you from well, these aren't side views. Here's the side view. This is where the stairs or platform lead up, and this is just the first level, kind of high up in the tower. You go upstairs, here's the second level, and the main boss area for the end of the campaign is up here. Now, there are little side passages and everything, and there's some interesting chambers that I'll go through. But one way or another, there are a couple of puzzles the player characters will have to deal with. I think this is like a walk of faith situation and a little side area. I seem to think there's a beholder there, if I remember correctly, but something's there. As you go further in, for this particular segment of the spire, there's some more Megan. There's a haunted ballroom type thing where various Netherese individuals are dancing, including a brain in a jar, which is hostile amongst those illusions and all that. The council chamber, guard passages, again, more Megan. This fun helmed horror with a brain in the jar attached to its head, which is a fantastic image, and all sorts of interesting things around there as well. A lot of the wizards from this city that didn't die or did die turned themselves into brains in jars. There are a couple other, different leads here as well. Like, for example, Veneranda says she needs the Staff of Power from the demilich in order to complete one of her personal quests. There's a lot of things that can happen regarding that, by the way. We've got different staffs or staves stored in different areas in those little side chambers. Here we have the den area with a chest called an abracadabras. It's a unique item designed for this adventure. It's just got it's a chest with a lot of charges, and you can look through it in detail yourself. The members bar area, I'm not going to go into detail every one of these again, but they're just neat little areas the player characters can explore and interact with. Chamber of sorcery, that sort of thing. Energy crystals. One interesting thing they encounter is these two weapons called living blades of disaster. They are very dangerous and powerful swords of destruction. They're great construct weapons that the player characters can fight, and they're great for other campaigns as well. The player characters will likely have to fight them and destroy them, and it will challenge them because these can do some serious damage. Now you get further up into the dome. There's the blades right there, and green crystal. I won't go into it, but it has it's part of the storyline of this particular chapter. Testing chambers, the different doors in this chamber all are tied to a school of magic. Player characters don't go through this correctly, they will have to start fighting various barbed devils. And you go further in, there's the star field where the cosmos, as was known by the Netherese, and they can study this a little bit. There's the wizarding chairs. It's all very interesting stuff and deals with Netheril at its time, or Ythryn at its time when it fell. And finally, as you go further in, you get this place, stasis chamber, where you get this fantastic image and what's called the spindle, which is an item that the mages in Ythryn found and brought into the city, which caused the calamity that led to its destruction. It's not tied to the fall of Netheril itself, but it's something that came to the realms 2,000 years ago, and then Ythryn found it sometime after that, destroyed the city, and then it's still here. Messing with it can be quite dangerous. Although don't stop the players from trying to mess with it. Let them find out what happens if they mess with an incredibly powerful object like this, which could literally destroy segments of the city. It could do just an immense amount of damage. It could shut down all magic for 24 hours, except living spells and some constructs. It could do some crazy things. and destroy the I think what Skydock Spire location 28. It can just wreak havoc there. Oh, it's not numbered here, but you can see it if you look through the adventure. Now, here's the library, of course, where the players can find a legendary scroll, which they can then literally summon a comet and other things, of course. As we go kind of into the final part of the adventure, although there are some other towers not listed here, eventually they go to Iria Larthus's study and they find some treasures. There's a living demiplane, which is a not particularly very hostile creature. It's a demiplane that is now alive and lingers around. It's kind of cowardly. Some flesh golems, some Megan. These are all enemies that can be aided in this final boss fight. And the player characters might eventually get the Demilich's Staff of Power, which can be used either against their enemies or it can be broken, or it could be used for another storyline in Ythryn if they wish to do some interesting things. It's the best way to put it. There's also some fantastic magic items, including the incantations of Irialarthus, which is some adventuring gear that Lich created, a scroll of Taras summoning, which could destroy Icewind Dale all over again or anywhere else. It was created for this adventure, and it'll destroy everything if the trash shows up, and no one can stop it. Of course, very interesting items, effectively. Now, finally, we go to some of the last towers, which the Tower of Evocation. Again, it's dancing light spells. It's all about evocation. There's some clues in there, again, to get into the main tower. There's this obelisk. Without going into super detail, the Staff of Power is needed to be broken to be able to recharge the obelisk. I believe this is tied to the Shattered Obelisk storyline. If the player characters don't do this correctly, or if they do it at all, the entire planet can be hurled back into the past. Like the entire population of the planet of Faerun or Toril, which is very weird if this actually happens. I think this has caused a lot of just a calamity, and I don't know how a DM would resolve that kind of storyline. It's kind of ridiculous and feels overpowered to me, but it seems like a better idea would be maybe a certain area in the planet might be hurled back, and that way doesn't lead to absolute destruction. It is very interesting. The DM could do a lot with this, and plus, again, this could tie into the Shattered Obelisk storyline. That could also maybe be used as a sequel to this adventure, although it's not really that high level. It's kind of like if you skip the earlier chapters, you could probably run the latter chapters of it as a follow up. There's the Tower of Illusion, of course, because there's one for each school of magic. And as we're finishing up, the Tower of Evocation and the Mythalar itself, it's essentially a legendary magic item which the player characters could attune to. Theoretically, they could lift the city if they have enough mages out of the ice and maybe even repopulate it. The campaign ends if the player characters go through all this and with a lot of open possibilities, including time travel, including releasing the Tarask, the Ythryn being restored. Various things can happen. The Arcane Brotherhood getting a hold of Ythryn, the whole city that is. There's all sorts of things. Now, there's the Hall of Weightless Wonders. Again, another location the player characters can go to and just kind of fly around in. The Tower of Transmutation with another clue. The Music Hall, where there is sort of the Netherese Esoteric Orchestra, which was paused halfway through when the city fell, which could be interesting. Skydock Spire, which is another tower which could get destroyed in the adventure if the player characters mess with the spindle. But if they don't do that, they can have some interesting things happen if they come here. There's a museum with Nothix. Again, this is like one of the main Nothic locations. Here's a spitting mimic, and a creature that was brought into this edition and brought back for this campaign. They do bring in the Farim a little bit. I don't think you actually fight them here, but they are a very dangerous foe to say the least. Now, as we conclude this chapter, and as well as this whole storyline and this campaign setting, the player characters will likely either have to deal with the Arcane Brotherhood as a follow-up, or maybe even fight and kill Valen and Avarice, or other members of that particular organization. They might even join the Arcane Brotherhood. The Brotherhood might end up with the city of Ythryn under their control, it could lead to a lot of other possibilities as a follow up to this campaign. Avarith, if she's still alive, could show up. As you go further, there's Rill, if she shows up and has not been quietly destroyed. These are the various creatures she comes here with, which could be another boss fight or something similar, depending on how the DM wants to run it. And finally, if the player characters go ahead and summon the Tarask, and what could happen with that, which I would not recommend, but you never know what player characters are going to do. Now, overall, for this chapter, it can go in a lot of different directions. When I ran it, like I said, I simplified it because of our campaign finally kind of falling apart, but we did finish it. You could run the whole thing and go beyond what's actually here. I would overall rate it a 4.5, mostly because it would be a 5 if they had explored more of each of the towers in more detail and there were some of the other locations in more detail. I feel like they almost glossed over everything just for space, which is understandable because it's a 7 chapter campaign and it's quite large as it is. But it'd be nice if some of these locations weren't just a single room location other than the main tower. There's the spindle's really interesting. There's some great places the player characters can interact with that are really unique. There's some great enemies, some unique enemies. It's a really good chapter. Again, my only criticism is some areas just kind of need to be expanded. And you could almost make Ythryn 2 or 3 chapters if you wanted to, because what's under the streets of Ythryn? What are in all these little towers? There's just so much you could do here. And it almost gives you a lot of material for a follow up to this campaign. Hey guys, if you liked this review and the others, please like this video and subscribe. I'll be doing a capstone review of the entire campaign after this, and then getting back to some single adventure reviews and very likely some other reviews of ongoing 5th edition storylines for different D&D campaigns shortly.